So this part of the service is really aimed at the children and young people, but I hope the adults will get something out of it as well. I don't know about you, but sometimes I think we go from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday without really stopping to think about the events that happened in between. And so I've got with me some resurrection eggs, and they're going to help us put together the story of that important week, which we call Holy Week. Each egg contains a clue, if you like, as to what's happening next in the story. So let's start with number 1. In this egg, we have a donkey. Why don't you pause the video for a moment and just talk to whoever you're with as to why there might be a donkey at this stage of the story. Well, that one wasn't too hard, was it? I'm sure most of you got it. It's because Jesus rode a donkey into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. It was a joyous day. The people pulled palm branches down and waved them. They shouted Hosanna. They threw their clothes, their cloaks in front of the donkey. It was a real day of celebration where Jesus was hailed as a king. But the events over the next few days were going to change things dramatically. So we come to our second egg. Can you guess what that is? I guess you did work out that it was coins. But these coins have a face on them. It's not the face of the Queen, the head of the Queen, as we would have on ours, but the head of the Roman Caesar, the Roman Emperor. Now, the reason that they're there is because Judas, who was one of Jesus's followers, had this idea that Jesus would come into Jerusalem and he would proclaim himself as the Messiah, God's chosen one, and that all the people, all the Jewish people would rally behind him and that they would try to overthrow the Roman rulers. But Jesus had a very different idea about what being a Messiah was, what being God's Messiah was. And Judas decided he'd try and force Jesus' hand. He went to the authorities, the Jewish authorities, and he said that he would bring them to Jesus at a time when Jesus wasn't surrounded by the crowds, when they could come and arrest him without fear of the riot starting. And for saying that, they paid Judas not 3, but 30 pieces of silver. So we come to our third egg. And in this egg, there is a cup. I wonder if you could work out why there would be a cup or a goblet that would have held wine, why that would be in there. Did you get it? Jesus, on the Thursday, which we now call Maundy Thursday, had a meal with his friends. It was a very special meal. It became known as the Last Supper because it was the last meal Jesus ever had with his friends. And at it, he did a couple of very surprising things. He took bread, he blessed it, and he broke it. And he said to them, "This bread represents my body, which is broken for you." And then at the end of the meal, he took some wine in a cup and he said, "The wine in this cup, that represents my blood, which is going to be poured out for you and for all humanity." The disciples didn't really understand what he was talking about. But every time we celebrate Holy Communion, we remember that meal. So now we come to egg number 4. And in there, we have some praying hands. Wonder if you can think why there might be praying hands. Did you get it? After the meal, Jesus went out with his disciples to the Mount of Olives, to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. And there he prayed. He was very troubled because he knew what lay ahead. and he prayed very earnestly to God, saying, "Father, if it's possible, will you take this away from me? But not what I want, what you want." Then, when he had finished praying, he went back to his disciples, and at that point Judas appeared. Now Judas had already agreed with the guards that there would be a signal, and the signal would be this: he would kiss Jesus, and then they'd know that that was the person they needed to arrest. And so he went up to Jesus, he kissed him on the cheek, and he said, "Rabbi," which means teacher. And then at that point the guards came forward, they grabbed Jesus, arrested him, and took him away to stand trial. So we come to egg number 5. And here we have something. It's a little bit hard to see from a distance, but it's supposed to be a crown of thorns. Now, I'm pretty sure you know why there's a crown of thorns, but perhaps you don't know how it came about. What happened was, when the soldiers had got Jesus, they began to mock him and taunt him. They spat at him, they beat him up, they stripped him of his clothes. And then they put on him a purple robe, which was the sign for royalty, for an emperor or a king. And they made a crown out of thorns, and they shoved that on his head. And then they spat and laughed and jeered and said, "Ha, you think you're the king of the Jews, do you? Ha!" And having tortured him like that, they then took him to Pilate, the Roman governor, to stand trial before him. Which brings us to our 6th egg. Excuse me. And in that, there's an item that I'm not sure you'll know what it is just from looking at it, so I'll tell you. It's supposed to represent a lash, a whip. Now that I've said that, maybe you can remember why that might be in there. When Pilate questioned Jesus, he couldn't find anything wrong, no crime that had been committed that Jesus should even stand trial before him, let alone be sentenced to death, which is what the authorities wanted. The Jewish authorities wanted him to be crucified, but only Pilate could give that order. Pilate said to them, "I can't see any reason why he should be crucified." But to keep them quiet, he ordered that Jesus should be whipped. And Jesus was taken away, and he was flogged. He was lashed 39 times. And then he was brought back to Pilate. And Pilate then showed Jesus his battered body, standing there before a large crowd that had gathered. And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for this man, Jesus of Nazareth? Shall I release him?" But they cried out, "No, crucify him, crucify him." And we're going to stop there now. We're going to sing a hymn and come back afterwards. So now we come to our 7th egg. Pilate felt that he'd had no choice but to send Jesus to his crucifixion. And so I don't think you'll have any trouble identifying what this is. It's a cross. But if you look closely, it's a cross that's made out of 3 nails. And the reason for that is because the Bible tells us how Jesus was nailed through one hand, through the other hand, and through his feet. And there he was, strung up like a criminal, dying on the cross. Which brings us to our 8th egg. And the thing that's in this might surprise you a little bit, because there it is. Dice, you'll think. It's a die if there's just one of them. And that die represents the soldiers. What happened was, as a perk of the job, the soldiers were allowed to take any of the belongings of the prisoners that they were crucifying and share them out between themselves. When they came to Jesus' robe, the one they'd stripped off him earlier, they found that it was made of one piece of material with no seams, And rather than tear it into pieces, they decided to gamble for it. And the person who won the game of dice got the robe. And all this was going on whilst Jesus was dying on the cross. Which brings us to our 9th egg, which is a spear. There's a bit more in the Gospels about what happened to Jesus when he was on the cross. I won't go into all of it now. There may be some young children watching, but if you do want to find out more about the story, it's in each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But this bit about the spear is just after Jesus has died. It could take days for people who were being crucified to die. But in Jesus' case, because he had been beaten up so badly already, it took 6 hours. And the soldiers were a bit surprised, so they decided to check that he really was dead. And to do that, they pierced his side with the spear. And from his side, we're told that blood and water flowed. It was a sign of death that the blood had separated, so they knew that he was truly dead. We're getting near the end of the story now. And here is a piece of linen cloth. I wonder if any of you can work out why we would have that. When Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, he was wrapped in a linen cloth in order that he could be placed in a tomb. Now, normally what would happen would be that the body of somebody who had died would be anointed with special creams and spices and then wrapped in the cloth. But it was near to sunset on Friday, which was the time that the Jewish holy day, their Sabbath, would begin. And no work was allowed after that. So Jesus' body was put in the tomb quite hurriedly. And that cloth had been wrapped round him. Our 11th item is a piece of stone. I think you might guess this, because this is to do with the tomb. After Jesus' body had been laid in the tomb, the guards had been given orders to roll a large rock, way larger than that, in front of the entrance to the tomb, so that no one could go in and try and steal Jesus' body away. And so we come to the Saturday. And Saturday was the rest of the Jewish holy day, and nothing happened. But on the Sunday morning, the women got up early. The Bible tells us they got up when it was still dark, and they went to the tomb, taking with them the spices and ointments that they wanted to put on Jesus' body, to do for him what they should have done before he was put in the tomb. As they got nearer, they worried about how they would get in there with the stone in the way. And that brings us to our last egg. Because in this egg, there is absolutely nothing. And that's because when they got there, the stone had been rolled away and the tomb was empty. There was no body in there. Instead, an angel sat there and said to the women, "Why are you searching for the living among the dead? He has risen from the dead just as he said." And the women went away rejoicing. And that's what Easter is all about. We remember when Jesus rose from the dead. Hallelujah.